Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and really pleased to be here. Thanks especially to the organizer, Alexandre, for setting this up. So this is a talk I wrote about a year ago for an APA session, which was devoted specifically to the question of why should we educate for intellectual virtues and education type issues. And so this is all about making the case for that. There's basically two parts to this talk. The first part is like theory, essentially, and the second part is application. So in the first part, I'm going to make a case for a theoretical case for why we should educate for intellectual character. I'm going to talk about the epistemic goals of education. I'm going to talk about what it might mean for education to be the development of intellectual character in the specific sense of cultivating the intellectual virtues, where I'll contrast that with another conception of educating for intellectual character, which is just educating for critical thinking skills, which are a much thinner notion. I want to consider two contemporary implications of educating for intellectual virtues, which I think are quite interesting. One is about disagreement in the information age, and the other is about extended cognition or neuromedia and the challenge that poses for education. And then I want to move on to application. And I want to consider three cases. They're all applied projects that I've been involved in, all interdisciplinary, all essentially educational projects, which, as I'll explain, involve bringing the intellectual virtues, either directly or indirectly, into an applied setting, which has educational aspects to it. So the three projects are extended cognition and special needs education, a prison education initiative, and a university-based curriculum project, which is actually going on now. Okay, so let's start off with theory. So obviously education serves many goals: social, political, practical, and so forth. So in saying that it has an epistemic goal, I'm not denying it has these other goals, but it seems to me that it clearly has an epistemic goal, and that the epistemic goal is in fact fundamental. By epistemic goals, I'm thinking about things like, we want good inquirers, know useful information, can reason well, and so on. The sense in which I think the epistemic goal is fundamental is that we couldn't make sense of an educational practice that didn't have epistemic goals. I mean, of course, we might call a practice an educational practice, even though it didn't have these goals, but it wouldn't really be an educational practice if it didn't have these goals. It would be something else. It'd be indoctrination or something. Moreover, the other goals of education, they only make sense if the epistemic goals are in place. Think about the political goal of education. Some people talk about the role of education in a democratic society as helping to create informed citizens. Well, you can't create informed citizens in a polis without giving them good information, which is relevant to making political judgment. So the epistemic goals are fundamental, and that raises an interesting question about what the overarching epistemic goals are. What at the most fundamental or general level are we trying to do epistemically in the educational enterprise? And I think the most plausible conception of this is a broadly Aristotelian one. It's one in which education is about the development of intellectual character in the specific sense of the subject's integrated set of intellectual virtues. And by the intellectual virtues, I'm going to say more in a moment, but I'm thinking of them again, along Aristotelian lines, broadly speaking, they're admirable intellectual character traits. Things like being curious, intellectually humble, having intellectual integrity, and so forth. So I'm not thinking of them just as sort of cognitive skills or faculties. They're these more sophisticated traits. I think we can see the plausibility of this view by comparing it to the alternatives. So you might think, well, why not think just education, its epistemic goals are just instilling epistemic states and skills into subjects, true beliefs, knowledge, and so on. But if you thought that was the overarching goal, then it becomes clear that there are ways of developing that in altogether problematic ways from an educational perspective. It's very interesting if you go and look at schools from 150 years ago. Some of you can go to places where you can see what they've recreated, what societies were like villages and things like that. And you can look at the schoolroom. Rote learning some of you may be familiar with this, the idea was the child goes off, they learn something from the textbook, then they come to the front of the class and then they have to recite it. And if they get it wrong, usually they get, whacked by the schoolmaster and so forth. Now, we think of that as a terrible way, that kind of rote learning, a terrible way to teach now. No one thinks that's a good way to teach. But if all we care about is instilling these epistemic states and skills into people, then it seems that would be an excellent way to teach. I mean, that might be the most effective way. And it's interesting to think, well, why do we think that it's problematic? Why do we think that it's so important for education to be involved, helping students to learn for themselves and to develop their own ways of thinking? And I think that goes hand in hand with a conception of education as being devoted to the cultivation of intellectual character. Moreover, I think it's concerned with thinking about intellectual character as opposed to simply giving people critical thinking capacities and so on. I think they're also lacking in crucial respects. So I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. So there's like a sort of thicker notion of intellectual character which involves the virtues, and a thinner notion which just involves thinking skills and so on. I think it's definitely the virtues line. So we'll come back to that. But first, let me say a little bit more about the intellectual virtues. And important to notice here that these are all properties in nearly every case, actually, which distinguish them from mere critical thinking skills. So the intellectual virtues, I claim, incorporate a characteristic motivational state. They're guided by a love of the truth, a desire for getting things right, for accuracy, for avoiding error. They're acquired and maintained in a distinctive fashion. We're not born with the virtues. We have to acquire them. We do so via emulation of exemplars, through a process of habituation where they become second nature to us. They're not like skills in the sense that once you have them thereafter. That's what's true of some skills at any rate. You have to keep cultivating them, otherwise they can be lost. They're essentially reflective in their cultivation. They're not things that one can acquire passively. So not only we're not born with them, but you can't acquire them passively through a kind of osmosis, which some skills, some cognitive skills, function like that. They're just part of our natural development. The virtues aren't like that. I think of the intellectual virtues, a bit more controversial, but I think of them as lying between two vices, a vice of excess and deficiency. Some people have disputed that's required for all virtues, but it seems right to me. Part of what it is to be virtuous is to navigate between those two vices. The virtues have a special kind of value. They enable us to flourish, and that's part of what's so important about them. Related to this, they promote our epistemic autonomy, active knowing and understanding. So the intellectually virtuous subject isn't just a passive recipient of information, right? They're active knowers, they're inquirers, they're guided by their love of truth to investigate, to inquire, to see how things fit together. And that's also why they seek out understanding, because understanding is more than just knowing, more than just mere knowing, because it involves seeing how things fit together. The intellectual virtues, they're integrated with one another, and indeed with the virtues more generally. So you have essentially integrated cognitive character. And they perform a managerial role in one's cognitive architecture. One might know lots of things, but the virtues will enable you to know what to do with that knowledge, right? So they have a kind of meta role to play. Notice that nearly all cases, the critical thinking skills aren't like this. I think the key difference actually I want to emphasize is the motivational state. You can have critical thinking skills and not be motivated by a desire for the truth. I mean, they could just be, you could just have them and employ them in ways that are entirely to do with, geared towards being successful in what you're doing, and not the concern for truth can drop out. Just as indeed a lot of our cognitive abilities are like that. They can be successfully manifested without the motivational state of a love of the truth being there. And many of these other traits, these are the properties of intellectual virtues, are also, seems to me, not true of the critical thinking capacities. Okay, so why educate for intellectual virtue? I think that the kind of picture on which we educate for intellectual virtue goes hand in hand with a view of education as a lifelong activity. which I think is very important. I think it's very important to differentiate between, there are moments in our lives where education is a more explicit part of our lives, but the right way to think about education is that we're all of us on an educational journey as part of our intellectual journey. There's no completed project here, as it were. The intellectual virtues, as I said, they have to be cultivated continually, or they're lost. That's what we're doing in education throughout our lives. So, it mitigates against that view in which education is just what happens, when it's in the formal sense. The formal sense is just making formal what's always part of our development as people. Related to this, I think it mitigates the prevailing conception of education, which I think is increasingly common among students I teach anyway, where education is viewed very much in a sort of piecemeal, task-focused way. It's unrelated to their wider personal development. It's a very capitalist-orientated way of thinking about education. It's the student as consumer, right? So it leads to an instrumentalist way of thinking about education. I think it's not a healthy way to think about it. And I think the virtues conception counters that quite nicely, because it shows how the role the virtues play in a life of flourishing and in your development of your cognitive character. So sure, there are proximate goals, educational goals that occur along the journey, but these are just elements of a wider educational journey. I won't go into this because it'll take too long, but I think it responds to enduring concerns about democratic education. And I'll say a bit more, I should borrow this to talk about Siegel actually. Issues about, helping people to be autonomous individuals. As Dewey says, we want sort of non-affirmative pedagogy. And I think that's effectively what we're doing. We're focusing on character rather than the content. And then it's the student gets to determine the fact their own values themselves, what we're giving them is the skills to do that. And then I want to talk about two very practical advantages, which are very relevant to helping students navigate the modern world. The first is the contemporary challenge posed by disagreement. And the second is the educational challenge posed by extended cognition. So let me just say briefly a bit about that. Oh, yeah. Before I do so, let me just mention Siegel. So throughout this, I've mentioned critical thinking skills. So there's a thinner conception of educating for character, which just says, no, just educate for critical thinking skills and not for the virtues. And there are various reasons Siegel offers for this kind of view. There is one argument, though, which I think we should meet head on. I won't read out the quotation, but the basic gist of it is this thought, that education for intellectual virtue is problematic because we're effectively instilling a particular set of values into the subject. And in doing so, we're not respecting the students' epistemic autonomy. We want it to be up to them what values that what they possess. And so we shouldn't be trying to instill particular values, particular dispositions and virtues. We should be making the case for them. That's what Siegel says. So he thinks that going for this thicker notion, therefore, is problematic because it's undermining the student's autonomy. And I think this relates, by the way, to another objection he has, which is, he thinks it's educationally too ambitious anyway to educate for intellectual virtues, because you've got to give these skills and because you've got to instill these values. I'd want to push back on both these challenges, but especially this one. The first thing to say, I think, is that no plausible educational strategy is completely open-ended in the way that Siegel imagines. Not even his own one. In effect, what he's doing here is putting autonomy on a pedestal here as a value that trumps other values. And I think that, when you think about it, that could be problematic in lots of different ways. Compare this with the virtues view. So on the virtues view, sure, autonomy is in the mix. It's in the mix as a value, as a virtue. But so is, for example, humility, listening to others, being aware of objections others say, respecting other people's opinions and so on. That's as much of a value. And indeed, trading off those two values is part of what it is to be virtuous, right? Trading off, as I would put it, intellectual tenacity, conviction, sticking to one's guns, with humility, listening to others, being aware of objections, being willing to change one's mind when called upon to do so. The challenge of the virtue is to see how these two things can combine. So the last thing we want actually is to put intellectual autonomy on a pedestal here. Moreover, insofar as we're talking about respect for students, it seems to me that you can exactly do that as part of educating for intellectual virtues. Although there are certain values in there, as there always are values with any educational enterprise, it seems to me the values are nonetheless really quite thin. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to just wanting students to care about the truth. And it strikes me that it's hard to understand what an educational enterprise would be that didn't have that at its heart, just as it's hard to imagine an educational enterprise doesn't have epistemic goals at its heart. So given that that's what we're doing, and you're giving students effectively the skills thereafter to make the decisions they want to make about the values they have. It's not like you're instilling a value system specifically into the students. So I think we can resist these kinds of worries. Moreover, as we'll see in a moment, I think both theoretically speaking, but also in some applied cases, having the intellectual virtues specifically in play rather than just merely critical thinking skills makes an important difference to how we approach the educational enterprise. Okay, so let's talk about disagreement. So disagreement's always been with us. It's always created epistemic challenges, but arguably these challenges are worse in the information age. We now have to navigate epistemic environments with multiple sources of information, often involving conflicting viewpoints, where misleading information is rife, the experts aren't obvious. How do we deal with this? I think part of the solution lies in educating the intellectual virtues, and crucially, not just for developing critical thinking skills. Notice I say part of the solution. So I think one part of the solution ought to be structural. I don't think the individual alone can deal with some of these challenges. I think we need ways of as it were, structuring the information environment, because it's too much to expect of the individual to deal with all these challenges. But I think there is something the individual can do, and that's we need to help them develop their intellectual virtues specifically. So think about some of these considerations. So on the virtues conception, caring for the truth, a concern for the truth is built into the virtues, right? That's part of the motivational drive that underpins the virtues. Compare that with, winning an argument. I mean, I think here's a crucial difference between, educating for critical thinking capacities, educating for virtues. When we educate for virtues, that's what we're instilling in the students, the importance of caring for the truth. Not just about winning an argument. Right? You give people critical thinking skills without that motivational state, then the danger is that's what you're creating people who are just concerned with winning an argument. And as we see, on Twitter and so on, it's that having people who are very good at arguing but who don't care about the truth can be a devastating combination. Intellectual imagination, which I think is a virtue. The willingness to explore different and opposing viewpoints, get this intellectual humility. These virtues are really important to how we deal with disagreement. Being intellectually conscientious, arguing with integrity. This isn't just thinking about oneself, one's own evidence and reasons and so forth, but being charitable to the opposition, fairly representing their arguments, not simply trying to trick them or something like that. Again, in the internet age, we can see a lot of these practices of, trying to have the sort of killer blow on the opponent, trying to get the opponent to trick them, as it were, into saying something they don't really want to say, and then use that to blow everything up against them. These aren't arguing. This isn't arguing with integrity, but that's what the virtuous subject would do. I already mentioned intellectual humility, showing genuine respect for others and their opinions. I think intellectual humility isn't just an inward-focusing notion; it's outward-focusing. You show one manifests one's intellectual humility by being interested in other people's views and respecting their views, and that leads to an intellectual respect for others. And as I mentioned previously, I think it's important here that the intellectual virtues are integrated. Having conviction is compatible with being intellectually humble. I mentioned this a moment ago when I talked about Siegel. We want autonomy, as it were, to be tempered by humility and vice versa. And that's how the virtues develop. They develop together. So we don't want humility which undermines conviction. right? Because conviction is also, value tenacity, right? So we need them to develop in concert with one another, so that your conviction is proportionate to what it ought to be, and your humility is proportionate to what it ought to be. So at an individual level, you can see how educated for intellectual virtues can be very important to helping an individual deal with the challenge posed by disagreement. There's another challenge as well, which is more of an educational challenge, which comes in the modern world from extended cognition. So extended cognition, it's an idea that comes from philosophy, but it's very prominent in the cognitive sciences. It's the idea that the features of a subject's cognitive environment, such as technology, can become seamlessly integrated into the subject's onboard cognitive processes, such that over time, the technology becomes part of those cognitive processes. It's not simply subject and instrument anymore. The instrument, as it were, has become part of the subject. So the way to think of it, I think, is like it's cognitive augmentation. We now have a sort of extended cognitive subject. Cognitive subject includes not just the subject and their onboard cognitive powers, but also the external technology which has been incorporated into their cognitive processes. Now, it's a big debate, is extended cognition, is it possible? If it is possible, is it widespread? Some people think it's widespread. Some people, the other end of the scale, don't think it's even possible. My view is, for what it's worth, is that it's possible, probably not as widespread as we think, but that it's becoming more widespread, and it will become more widespread as technology develops. Indeed, I think there's a particular kind of extended cognition which I think will become very widespread soon, which many tech companies are trying to develop right now, which we can call neuromedia. Neuromedia is like a sort of advanced form of extended cognition. So this is information processing, extended cognitive processes. So not merely what are known as embodied cognitive processes, which often aren't information processing, but information processing. But the thought is the information processing technology is so seamlessly integrated with the onboard cognitive processes that the subject, at least at the moment, may be unable to distinguish between the two. So imagine memory gets offloaded, let's say, to some external device, and it's not clear in the moment, are you using the biological memory or are you using the extended memory? That would be the goal of neuromedia, make it seamless as possible. Indeed, often neuromedia, the thought is that we think of extended cognitive processes being the cognitive processes were extending outside the skin of the subject, but of course neuromedia might actually be under the skin, because that's one way of making the use of the technology more seamless, right? Because there's less of an interface element to it. What you're striving for is a situation where the relationship to the technology isn't one of subject and instrument anymore. It just feels just like the normal cognitive processes, even though you've got an augmentation in play. Now, I don't think we have neuromedia yet, but I think arguably we will have neuromedia. I mean, that's what there doesn't seem to be any principal reason to prevent this. It's just a technological and engineering issue, and it looks like it's the kind of thing we will surmount. But what would education look like in a world of neuromedia? I think this is a really important question. Because if you think that education is just about giving people skills and knowledge, as some people do, and if we can offload a lot of our cognitive skills and technology to extended cognitive processes, indeed to neuromedia, then what is the role of education in the modern world? Why wouldn't education just get replaced by a kind of engineering, right, which is aimed at cognitive augmentation? You might say, look, in the past, students had to learn really quite complex arithmetic, and now, we don't need to anymore because we've got calculators. In the future, they don't even need to know how to use the calculators because there'll be some sort of calculating module built into them. So why can't all of these, everything education teaches be like that, right? And then we just dispense with education altogether. I think we feel that there's still something for education to do, even in a neuromedia age, and it's hard to explain what that is unless you have a conception of education that has the intellectual virtues at its heart. And there's a reason for that, because whereas you can offload skills and states and so forth to extended cognitive processes, I don't think it's plausible that you can offload intellectual virtues to them. So the thought is there'd still be a role for education to play at cultivating intellectual character, even in a world where neuromedia is right. I think there's lots of reasons why this would be so. Let me mention a few of them. One is to do with the managerial role and the cognitive economy, which makes the intellectual virtues very different from ordinary cognitive skills. They are, as it were, part of what helps to govern the cognitive skills. So as it were, it's the lower level skills that get offloaded to technology, but the higher level skills that remain. And the virtues are enhancing those higher level skills that want to play the managerial role. There's also the issue of the motivational states being part of the virtues. We can't, there doesn't seem to be any coherent sense in which we can offload motivational states to technology in the extended cognitive process way. It's still going to be your states, your motivational states, right? So that's going to mean, again, there's no sense the idea the intellectual virtue is offloaded. I mean, maybe the underlying skills are, but not the virtues. Moreover, remember that the intellectual virtues are essentially active and reflective. They're active in their manifestation, reflective in their acquisition. That makes them very different to other cognitive skills. You know, the cognitive skills that are most apt for offloading to neuromedia, to extended cognition, are precisely the passive, unreflective ones, right, where there isn't this contribution from the intellectual subject. So if you put these ideas together, I think there's a reason to think, thinking of the educational practice in terms of intellectual virtues and intellectual character can explain what role education plays even in a world where neuromedia is rife. Okay, now let me just run through some ideas of application. So that's the theory side of it. As I say, I want to talk about 3 applied projects. They're all interdisciplinary, they're all projects that I've been involved in. And in all cases, the results from these have been published. So there's I'll give you the references at the end, and I'll see if we can send around the PDF of the presentation as well, so people can look at this. So you can follow up this if you like. So the first project was a project I ran with colleagues in the social scientists at a Scottish school, which was focused on special needs education. What we were interested in was how technology gets used in special needs education. So technology gets used increasingly in education, but in special needs education, special needs education is the vanguard of the use of technology, because you've got students with specific cognitive deficits, and technology is being used and developed to try and counter those deficits. It's what's called assistive technology. And we were specifically interested in, how this technologically embedded educational environment that you find in special needs school, we've got the assistive technology, to what extent does that manifest extended cognition? And our thought was that if we could understand that, then this would give us a foretaste of how technology might look like in mainstream education in the future. So as it were, that special needs education is sort of the vanguard, and then mainstream education will follow the trends in special needs education in terms of the use of technology. We were focusing on assistive technology that was information processing, so not obviously special needs education. A lot of technology is more of the embodied kind, and more of the wheelchairs and things like that, and so forth. We were looking at stuff that was specifically information processing and looking at the subject's relationship and the educational practices that underpinned it. And what we found again and again, looking at various case studies, was that the relationship the subject had with assistive technology wasn't just subject and instrument. That wasn't the way they talked about it. Moreover, the educational goal of the educators who worked very closely, special needs education is often one-to-one, at least at this school anyway. The educational goal was precisely to help students with the seamless integration of assistive technology. So to give you an example, one of the case studies we looked at was a student called Max, and his teacher, Jacob. Max needed a new Braille reader. He was blind. His Braille reader the technology had become defunct, so he was trying to choose a new one. We watched this process quite closely. One kind of technology got rejected because it couldn't be used seamlessly enough. The new one was eventually adopted, the second one, precisely because it could be used seamlessly. The educator was trying to help the student in terms of this integration, right? That was specifically part of of what they were trying to do. So, moreover, the other thing that was quite interesting here is that it's not just that the educator was trying to help them use it seamlessly, but they were trying to do it in a way that also developed their virtuous intellectual character. So it wasn't just that they were scaffolding the adoption of the technology, of what you would expect in an educational context, but they were also generating what educationalists call productive struggle. So they were scaffolding, but they're also trying to help create challenges in a controlled way for the students to overcome, precisely because they were trying to help them develop their autonomy of use with the technology, and thereby make it more seamless with the use. So what we have then with this assisted technology is, it seems like we've got something which is functioning not just as subject and instrument, but as extended cognition, and where the educational practices are assisting with that, but also quite specifically assisting with that in a way that would help develop virtuous intellectual character on the part of the subjects, right? Not just that they want them to passively learn how to use the technology, but to be active, epistemically responsible individuals employing that technology. Our results fit very well with the social model of disability, which is now a widespread model that's kind of replaced the individualistic medical model. On this model, we understand disability as a mismatch between the subject's abilities and the environment. And what we were arguing is that construing assistive technology as extended cognition, it shifts the focus of the environment from the physical and social to the technological, which we think is important. And this has a number of implications. Many of these implications were already manifest in the educational practices themselves. But making it explicit, I think, theoretical basis helps, and not least helps the educators when they're trying to explain what they're doing to the powers that be. So, for example, allowing assistive technology in assessments, if you think of them as part of the subject's cognitive processes, that's very important. Allowing students to retain their assistive technology outside school. This was a big issue. Some of these assistive technologies are very expensive. Teachers wanted the students to be able to take them home. The educational board was skeptical about this. If you think of them as cognitive augmentations like this, then there is a strong case for them going home. Training teachers to cognitive integrate assistive technology, they weren't trained for this, is what they did. They're good teachers, they instinctively learn how to do this. But it ought to be made explicit, because it is part of what good teaching involves in. And moreover, that integrating assistive technology goes hand in hand with cultivating virtuous intellectual character. So that's precisely how these educational practices function. It's not just you want the students to passively learn how to do this, you want to create the productive struggle that helps them to virtuously master the technology. Okay, so that was the first project. The second one is a philosophy in prisons project. This artwork, by the way, was made by one of the prisoners involved in this. Again, this was back at Scotland. It was a project I ran for several years, still running now with different personnel. It's a Scotland-wide, it's an interdisciplinary project, and it's devoted to bringing philosophy into prison education, but also to evaluate its effectiveness. We used a very interesting approach for this. It's what's called the Community of Philosophical Inquiry, or COPI. It's a way of teaching philosophy. I mean, I'm not sure I even like calling it teaching philosophy, because it's more like teaching thinking in its purest sense. So, I mean, you can think of that as philosophy, but I think you can equally think of it as, it's kind of, so in particular, when you use COPI, you're not teaching a subject matter. It's really important. What you're trying to do is strip away everything that's extraneous to discussion, to target the articulation of reasons, one's own and one's others, and to facilitate a conversation which is reasons focused, so people can come to understand reasons and reasoning. So it's a way of, it's effectively a kind of critical thinking type approach. Although, as we'll see, I think it actually promotes the virtues. The methodology for this was that we were training up, we found a group of teachers who are already involved in prison education, who already rapport with prisoners, which is very important, rather than just, bringing people who have no connection to the prisoners in and then trying to do this wouldn't work. People have already got those relationships. We trained them up in the COPI method, created a curriculum for them, and then we watched it go, and then we tracked throughout the educational impact of this initiative. It's also, of course, very important here with COPE that with prisoners, you don't know anything about their educational background, which can be very variable. COPE is often used in schools, actually in elementary schools, primary schools, for this reason. But it's perfect for prisons because many prisoners have there's high levels of illiteracy, low educational backgrounds. So, for example, teaching content or getting people to read books or so forth, this can be problematic. But if you have an educational approach that doesn't presuppose any of that, then that's ideal. So this worked out rather well. Doesn't presuppose any background knowledge or prior intellectual expertise. The studies that the social scientists ran alongside this were trying to track development of useful cognitive skills. And we found a bunch of things. In fact, you can read the paper which I cite at the end. There were 4 main areas of cognitive development that they found: critical reasoning skills, intellectual openness, intellectual respect for others, and intellectual self-respect. Those are the 4 categories of development. And the developments here actually were remarkable. I mean, if you take a look at the paper, you'll see what I mean. It's a qualitative rather than a quantitative analysis. We're tracking these students individually in interviews with them and their educators. But the results are really quite astonishing in terms of their development. What's especially interesting, though, is that you might think, well, all we're doing here is developing their critical thinking skills, but not so. It's very clear that what's being developed here in the way that we're doing here is that we're also developing the motivational states that go along with the intellectual virtues. So, for example, it's not just that they become better at winning arguments, let's say, although they do become better at that. They become better at understanding other people's points of view, expressing other people's point of view, respecting other people's point of view, listening to other people's point of view, and so on. I mean, that goes hand in hand with their respect for accuracy and truth, and their intellectual self-respect, which I think is a really important element here. Many of the students lacked intellectual self-respect. That's self-reported at the beginning. It talked about their growth in their self-respect by the end. This helped them to value themselves and to value others. So, as it were, values are coming into being, but they're really the values flowing directly from understanding the value of truth and then seeing that in the context of the development of intellectual virtues. So, and I think this, relates very well, going back to Siegel's objection. You can use something like COPE, which has no, I mean, it's construed one way, it's like its education in its purest form. There's no subject matter at all, right? And yet, you can end up with people developing the intellectual virtues. And this shows how the autonomy, promoting the autonomy of the subject can be a key part of educating for intellectual virtues. There's no tension there, and certainly not in the way that Siegel says. And moreover, I think it raises the fact that critical thinking done well will inevitably become educating for critical thinking done well will inevitably become educating for intellectual virtue. That's the way I would put the point. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is a curriculum project, and this is one thing I'm involved in now. Again, interdisciplinary project. We're trying to bring the intellectual virtues into the heart of the curriculum. No one's done this before for an R1 university, so it's quite exciting. It's been running as a pilot for a few years now, but now it's become, from this year, it's been massively expanded. We've had quite a lot of funding from the Templeton Foundation to help facilitate this. We call the virtues the Antita virtues. That's Peter the Antita, it's a mascot. So the 4 Antita virtues we focused on are curiosity, integrity, intellectual humility, and intellectual tenacity. If you like, I can tell you a little bit about the rationale for choosing those 4. We have created a suite of specially designed modules. They represent a range of disciplinary and historical perspectives. Students progress through the modules right the way through the curriculum. They start off at orientation, and then as they move through their degree, they go into more and more increasingly advanced modules. And we're accompanying this with a longitudinal educational study, which is examining the effects of this pedagogical intervention. We're very lucky at UCI. We had a Mellon-funded project a few years back, which created this incredible database for measuring educational outcomes. It's the biggest of its kind. So we've got the 2 things working together. So we can measure the educational outcomes of large numbers of students progressing through the curriculum, compare it with students who aren't taking the modules, and we can see the effect. Some of the results are already out. I'll give you the reference in a moment, mostly from the pilot rather than the longitudinal study, but we're getting very good results. We take students who are doing effectively, if you know this kind of thing, need for cognition surveys before and after, and then we're seeing the differences, and we're comparing it against the student data set that we've got. We're seeing quite dramatic improvements in the educational outcomes. What's very interesting, though, is that, as I'm sure you know, whenever you make an educational intervention, you usually get good results because it's an intervention. But normally what happens is the people who are doing well benefit the most. And the people who are doing not so well usually benefit the least from an intervention. What we find with this, though, is that the benefits are stable across the demographics. It doesn't matter about your educational background, your first generation or what have you. It doesn't matter about ethnicity, gender, and so on. So that's actually, the kind of holy grail of an educational intervention, where you have strong effects and that they're stable across the demographics. And so this is what we're trying to expand just now. The moral is that education, education with intellectual virtue promotes strong educational outcomes. But more than that, one thing we're showing, I think, with this is that this can work at the higher education level. Right? You might think that it's not necessary or appropriate higher education. Well, it turns out it is. Moreover, being explicit about this is also a value. I mean, this is one of the findings, not just to educate for intellectual virtues, but it's certainly a higher education level to be explicit about that, so the students have a way of thinking about their development, in giving them a language to make sense, conceptual scheme to make sense of their intellectual development. In terms of the virtues, this actually enhances the educational effect of educating for intellectual virtue. Okay, so I've argued that the overarching epistemic goal of education is developing the intellectual character by the cultivation of intellectual virtues, so they can help students navigate the screens of the information age. They can't be offloaded technology via extended cognition, unlike other cognitive skills. And I've given you 3 cases of educational projects that have shown this in action. And there's some literature there, which, as I say, I'll ask for the PDFs to be sent around so everyone can, if you're interested, you can follow up on this. And in each case, actually, there's more literature. I've just picked one thing for each one.